Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 8, Lesson number 4. So for this lesson, guys, I want you guys, again, as always, you want to go ahead and go over the opening questions. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a few minutes to work on these. You want to make an attempt at these, write them down into your Evernote, and when you feel like you're confident about the answers, go ahead and unpause the video and check them out. So go ahead and pause the video right now. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over the answers. What molecule is created at the end of photosynthesis? Bam, good old-fashioned glucose. It's basically sugar. It's a carbohydrate. And that's the end result of photosynthesis. And you're going to learn today that another cycle actually uses this molecule to make energy from as well. The next one is, which organelle is responsible for making energy in the cell? The mitochondria. So when you think about the power plant of the cell, always remember, it's the mitochondria. Last one, what is the relationship between the independent and dependent variable? The independent variable is changed to see what happens to the dependent variable. Hopefully you guys have a much better understanding of that now that you've finished the experiment. And this last question here is just to review that idea. Okay, so the last lesson, Chapter 8. Here's my goal for you guys. I want you guys to understand how sugar is used to generate energy in the form of ATP. So, the second thing is I also want you guys to understand how students will be able to describe how sugar is turned into energy in the form of ATP. So you're going to know that ATP is created and what does it, and you're going to be able to describe how it takes place. Now, fair warning to you guys. This one's a lot like the chapter on photosynthesis. It's complicated, a lot of things are going on, and you're probably going to have to pay close attention and maybe have to watch this video twice or find somebody else's video online that does it better, or as always, ask me in class, because this one's pretty complicated. I won't deny it. Okay, so first off, cellular respiration. This entire lesson is all about this topic right here, cellular respiration. It's the turning of sugar and fats into energy for the body. And the energy we're talking about here is in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now, it follows the following chemical formula. It follows C6H12O6, this is glucose, plus oxygen. Maybe this is why you have to breathe. It turns into carbon dioxide and water. This might explain why you have to breathe out carbon dioxide. And obviously, you have energy in the form of ATP. Okay, now there's two processes in cellular respiration. The first part is called the anaerobic respiration. This is the part of cellular respiration that does not require oxygen, meaning that it can be done in the absence of any oxygen. And this includes the area we call glycolysis. And I'm going to go into much more detail explaining glycolysis later, but essentially the part that's called anaerobic respiration is glycolysis. Now there are two other types of anaerobic respiration that don't require oxygen, but I'll go over those at the very end. The next one is called aerobic respiration. If you've ever played a video game from one of those old school RPGs, you might have seen the word aereo all the time. It's because aereo means air, and usually in the video games, it's some kind of a wind-based air attack in the game. So this is where they get that word, is the word aereo. So it's aerobic, air respiration. So it's this part of cellular respiration that actually requires oxygen. This includes the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. Oops, might have misspelled that. I'll change it on the PowerPoint later. So, and you're going to explain both of these today. You're learning about all three of these processes today. Like I said, it can be complicated, and they're all interrelated. Okay, a quick overview, guys, of what you're going to learn today. The things we're looking at today is going to happen here in the mitochondria. Essentially, what happens is this, is that the first thing that takes place is glycolysis. Glycolysis then goes into the Krebs cycle, which then moves into the electron transport chain. And along the way, you have a series of molecules that are created. You have ATP, which you already know is a fuel source of the cell, and you get two other molecules you probably haven't seen before. You get NADH and FADH2. These molecules right here are used exclusively in the electron transport chain, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. And these little electrons right here are just telling you that electrons are being transferred from this process, and they're being stored on these molecules right here. Okay, glycolysis. This is the very first step in the cellular respiration. Glycolysis takes glucose and turns it into pyruvate. Now, glucose is a 6-carbon molecule right here. And what happens is that glucose is converted and turned to a molecule here called pyruvate at the very end. And energy is created in this process in the form of ATP and NADH. But you can also see right here that at the very beginning, ATP is actually put into the process. You have to spend some of your energy to split the molecule. So some ATP is input into a glucose molecule, and that splits the molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules. So basically it cuts it in half. And then this cut in half molecule is called G3P. And then it goes through a bunch of processes, and don't worry, I had to memorize every step along the way here. Don't worry, you don't have to do that. You're not in college yet. And what happens at the end is that you get 2 ATP are created, and you have 1 NADH. Now ATP is basically fuel. You can use that straight out. Now you've already spent an ATP up here. What that means is that this whole process of glycolysis, your end result is you get a pyruvate molecule, an NADH molecule, and you get 1 ATP. Now remember, you're getting 2 ATP here, but remember, you spent 1 up here too. So you're not getting a lot of energy from this process. You're only getting 1 ATP total and 1 NADH. So you don't get a lot of energy from glycolysis. It's mostly a process and a step to get you to create pyruvate. And pyruvate is going to be an important part in the next step. And that's going to go into what's called the Krebs cycle. Okay, so the Krebs cycle. You're probably looking at this thinking, oh my lord, this looks complicated. And I'm not going to deny it. Trust me, it is. So you might have to watch this a couple of times and study this graph. I had to spend about an hour reading over this stupid thing back in college to figure out what was going on. It's not simple, but it's really kind of important to see how it's working. So what the Krebs cycle does is the Krebs cycle takes pyruvate, which is the end result of glycolysis, and it turns it into energy. Now, since electrons are being removed, this process is called an oxidation reaction. You'll learn more about that in chemistry, but it's something I just want to toss out there. So when you hear that term oxidation, you're like, haha, Krebs cycle. Now, what happens is this. Is that pyruvate is turned into NADH, FADH2, and ATP. Now, ATP is already energy the body can use. So once you have ATP, you're good. That can go off and do something else. Now, the NADH and the FADH2, these are 2 other molecules. They're going to go off into something called the electron transport chain. And that's going to be the next step in this process I'm going to explain. But before I do that, let me go ahead and just do a quick little rundown of the cycle. Now, all of this happens right here inside of the mitochondria. Now, glycolysis happens outside the mitochondria in the cytoplasm. So this is the first step that actually begins to take place inside the power plant. So what happens is this. The pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon molecule, is changed, has one of the carbons pulled off, and that carbon's turned into carbon dioxide right here. But in that process, you turn 1 NAD into 1 NADH, and this right here will become energy later. And that turns the molecule into what's called acetyl coenzyme A, which is this 2-carbon molecule plus a coenzyme A. Don't worry about what coenzyme A is. It's not important. Just know that it's there. Now, what happens next is this molecule here binds to a 4-carbon molecule that comes from an earlier part in the Krebs cycle. So that creates a 6-carbon molecule called citric acid. Now what then happens is that the carbons are now basically being pulled off piece by piece. So you have a carbon pulled off on this step right here, so you have 6 carbons, now you have a 5-carbon compound. Another carbon is pulled off and turned to carbon dioxide, another NADH is created, and then you have an FADH2 is created, and you have some ATP and more NADH. So between this 5-carbon compound and this 4-carbon compound up here, you get 1, 2, 3, 4 molecules of energy your body can use later. Now this 4-carbon molecule right here is what's then used again in this process up here. So you have the pyruvate comes back down, you have the acetyl coenzyme A, which then combines with a 4-carbon compound that came from over here, and you get a brand new citric acid molecule. Boy, this is complicated. Like I said, you're going to have to look at this a couple of times, guys. So don't expect to see this once and memorize it, because boy, it did not happen that way for me. So the next step, once you have gone through the Krebs cycle, you're going to go something that's called the electron transport chain. Now, you've heard this before in photosynthesis, and there's 2 electron transport chains, and they have similar proteins, but they're not fully the same. As you might look at the proteins, they do look different. If you were to go back and look at the electron transport chain for photosynthesis, there are some similarities, but there's also quite a few differences as well. What happens here is this, is that the Krebs cycle, as you guys know, and so does glycolysis, which would happen up here, creates 3 molecules, NADH, NADH, and FADH2. All 3 of these molecules are essentially electron receptors, and what that means is that they're basically molecules that are crazy unstable. They're constantly shaking. They have that electron, they want to give it up, but they hold on to it. And what happens is they encounter this protein right here. It's inside of the membrane of the mitochondria. You can see the membrane right here. And these 3 electron molecules are put into this protein right here that come from the FADH, that come from the NADs and FADHs. What then happens is that these electrons travel through a series of proteins. And every single time an electron travels through these proteins, a hydrogen molecule is moved from inside the mitochondria to a space that's in this little part out here. So it goes from inside this part right here to outside the part right here. And every single time it goes through one of these proteins, that a hydrogen is moved over here. Now you might be saying, well, why does that matter? Doesn't that just make this side more acidic because there's more hydrogens over here? And yes, it does. What then happens is that these hydrogens that are on this side and are moved over here by the electrons going through these proteins now go through a protein we call ATP synthase. ATP synthase takes hydrogen, and when it goes through it, it takes hydrogen and creates ATP. It's a protein that is powered by acid. It actually takes hydrogens and turns those hydrogens into ATP. Now, you might sit there and see, once a hydrogen goes through it, these hydrogens then combined with oxygen to create BAM. You might know that molecule. We call it water. The end result of this process is water. Is it crazy how all that happens? How you can take electrons and you can make things more acidic, as happens over here. Then the acids travel through this protein and it makes ATP. The end result of this whole process is you get 32 ATP molecules. Almost all of your energy from this whole cellular respiration process comes from this last part right here. It comes from the ATP synthase that creates these 32 ATP from that one pyruvate molecule you had here in the very beginning. And that's it. That's the whole process, guys. Now, like I said, this can be really hard to follow the first time. You might have to look at the diagrams in the book, and you might have to watch the video again, or you might have to come talk to me for another explanation. This is not simple. A lot of crazy stuff is happening right now. But the end result of all of it is 32 ATP, and your body can use that ATP as energy. So, going on, that's everything finished. So we're done with essentially what's called cellular respiration. Now, there are other ways your body can make energy, though, and these processes are anaerobic, which, as I said beforehand, these mean they don't require oxygen. And this process is called fermentation. This is when your body can take glucose and turn it into an alcohol or lactic acid. Congratulations, guys, your body can make alcohol. It's haram. So, there's 2 types of fermentation. There's lactic acid fermentation, which is basically just a type of fermentation that takes sugar and turns it into lactic acid. And then there's ethanol fermentation, which takes glucose and turns it into ethanol. I had a little mistake right here. I'll go ahead and fix that for the PowerPoint, but it turns it into ethanol. Now the problem here though is that it creates 2 ATP. So it's not a lot of energy being created here, but what it does do is it recycles NADH. Now you've probably seen NADH from the other parts right here like this, and you can see NADH is pretty important. The problem is if your body runs out of NAD, it can't make any more NADH. So if you're going for a run or you're playing football on the field, your body all of a sudden has to find a way to make more energy fast. And your mitochondria can't always keep up. And one of the downsides is that NADH, or the NAD molecule needed to run cellular respiration and all these other steps, runs out. And if it runs out, your body can't make energy and you're screwed. So your body has to find a way to get more NADH. And that's where the fermentation comes in. So here's 2 diagrams of lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. And here's what happens. Is that what happens is you have glucose and it undergoes glycolysis. This is the very standard, you've already seen that. This is part of cellular respiration. And then the pyruvate, rather than going into the Krebs cycle, takes a different route and turns into lactic acid. When it does that, it takes an NADH molecule and turns it back into NAD+, which then can be reused in glycolysis, or this NAD+ can be used in the electron transport chain. This can now be reused someplace else. So the real purpose of fermentation, guys, at the end of the day, is to turn NADH back into NAD. That way this whole process doesn't stop working. Because if you run out of NAD+ right here, everything falls apart, because you have to have NAD+ to create these NADH molecules that run the electron transport chain. And if you run out of these molecules, which can happen, you're going to die. That's a bad thing. So your body wants to find a way to fix that. And that's why it uses these fermentation pathways, is to take excess NADH your mitochondria can't use fast enough, and it takes those molecules and puts them back into NAD. And alcohol fermentation, it's no different. The only difference is that lactic acid is a 3-carbon molecule here, and ethanol is a 2-carbon molecule here. They essentially do the exact same thing. They just have different ending molecules. Now, bringing everything together. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration, they work together. So, in photosynthesis what happens is sunlight comes down, and using photosynthesis turns that sunlight into glucose down here. Glucose is then used by the mitochondria right here, and it goes through the cycle here, and glucose, which comes through here, gets ATP, turns into pyruvate, goes through the Krebs cycle, goes to the transport chain, and the end result of this process is bang, it's water. Now, the photosynthesis needs water that comes from this process right here, and it also needs, but this process here needs oxygen. Well, what do you know? Photosynthesis creates oxygen needed for here. Now down here, it gets even more crazy. He goes, this system right here needs carbon dioxide. Luckily, the mitochondria creates carbon dioxide, which gets turned into sugar, which then gets turned back into carbon dioxide. So quite literally, plants take carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into sugar. And when you breathe out carbon dioxide, plants can use that carbon dioxide to recreate sugar. These 2 processes, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, work in balance with each other. Plain and simple. And if we didn't have one, the other couldn't survive. It's amazing how awesome this process is and how it works so well. So don't forget, photosynthesis works together with cellular respiration to keep everything essentially in balance. It's crazy cool. Okay, lesson review. First off, cellular respiration, basically just turning glucose into energy in the form of ATP. But boy, as you already know, it's a lot more complicated than that. Anaerobic respiration, this is just it's cellular respiration that doesn't need oxygen. This includes fermentation and glycolysis. Aerobic respiration is respiration that requires oxygen, and this includes the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. Fermentation comes in two types. You have lactic acid fermentation and ethanol fermentation. And remember, the purpose of fermentation is to take NADH and turn it into NAD+. That way your body doesn't run out of NAD+, because that's bad. And photosynthesis and cellular respiration work together so that it's one's reactants and then one's products. So essentially, photosynthesis creates glucose and oxygen, and cellular respiration takes that glucose and oxygen and makes energy, which then the waste product from this can be used in this to make more stuff. All right, I'm done talking, guys. Thank you for paying attention. This lesson was probably a doozy for you guys because it's got a lot of crazy things going on. So you want to go into the folder I gave you, open up the cellular respiration document, complete the activity, copy the finished document to your Chapter 8 Evernote, and bam, you are done. Thank you for watching, guys, and I hope you have an awesome day.